And gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Larry O'Connor and Mr. Brad Thor.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedoms around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. I am going to be uncharacteristically brief in my introduction of our special guest tonight because I know that the more time I'm up here, the more time I'm stealing away from the conversation we have in store for you this evening. I've been looking forward to welcoming Brad Thor back to the Reagan Library for some time. I wish I could say that he's been with us following the publication of all 19 of his best-selling novels, because it's always good to see him here, whether it's after he's produced another exciting book or not. Brad is exactly the type that President Reagan envisioned we would welcome here time and again. I say that not only because he has proven to be among the very best contemporary writers in our nation. As you all know, his talents have taken our imaginations into the fantastic life and times of Scott Horvath for an entire generation. But if President Reagan were with us today, it's a certainty that his admiration for Brad would also stem from the fact that he is first and foremost an American patriot dedicated to his country and our way of life. He's an unwavering supporter of our men and women in uniform, our intelligence professionals, first responders, law enforcement, and all of our public servants who most often anonymously put their lives on the line to protect our freedoms every day. His writing has literally helped millions of readers understand the transformation of American security challenges from the Cold War that Ronald Reagan helped to bring an end to this whole new world disorder we face today, one that's full of terrorists and cyber warfare and failed states, all the things that we all know that Brad writes about successfully each and every year. It's a genuine honor to have Brad here with us. Tonight, we also have another treat. When Brad accepted our invitation to talk about Backlash, his newest book, I was delighted to hear he'd be bringing with him our second guest this evening to make for a great conversation. Interviewing Brad on stage tonight about his exciting novel is someone that you all likely know and admire from all of his work on television and radio and in print. I know I do. Larry O'Connor is with us as well this evening. You've no doubt seen him on Fox News, read his weekly column in the Washington Times, or heard his voice over the years on KABC, or my hometown favorite, WMAL in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a big honor. If you would please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library our best-selling author, Brad Thor, and Mr. Larry O'Connor.
All right. Do you want this bottle of water that's under here?
I'm going to use that
You
glass,
good?
I think.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Wow. Thank you for such a nice introduction, John.
Way too kind. Thank you so much.
Stage right, I'm stage
I am
left.
stage right.
All right.
Although it does say, now it says the opposite. All right.
This is what they told us.
We're sitting in the chairs that are actually labeled the opposite of how we're sitting. I hope that doesn't throw anybody.
We're good.
Already downhill. I'll never be
Yeah.
invited back. Brad Thor, good to see you.
It's good to see you,
here
Larry.
on the West Coast.
Yeah, thank you.
Where we first met, actually.
We did meet out here, that's right.
Brad and I have known each other for about 10 years. When I got my start in this new world, for me at least, of political punditry and commentary, it was our mutual friend Andrew Breitbart who introduced us, and now here we are. And Andrew's favorite thing to do in the world was going through an airport, seeing somebody reading a Brad Thor book, and then he would call Brad and say, hang on a minute, and then he'd hand
Just hand it to a stranger, yeah.
How did you deal with that, by the way? That must have been fun.
It was interesting. I felt uncomfortable for the strangers in the airport. We put him on the phone, this crazy guy with all this hair saying, here, there's somebody on the phone for you. But it was lovely. He used to do that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, this is the 19th book, right?
It is.
And I've read all of them. Who here is with me? Who's read the entire canon of Brad Thor?
Wow.
Look at that. That is some pretty
Wow.
impressive stuff. And by the way, while we're at it, who has already read Backlash? Okay,
there's
so a few.
few
Good.
hands in here.
Now, you guys know how hard a job I have because there's a whole lot in this book that, well, Scott Harvath's world is turned a little upside down in this book.
It is, and I let loose with a spoiler when I was at an event in Dallas, and I almost got set upon by all these lovely readers in the audience, so I have to be careful not to give anything away. So my dad is a no longer active Marine, and my mom was a flight attendant for TWA. They taught me that I should treat every day on the job as if it's my first day on the job. So my goal with each book is to get better, because this is my annual performance review right now that I'm doing. So when you leave a review online or you tell a friend about the book, that means I've done my job. So with Backlash, I wanted to do something I'd not done before, really turn things upside down. And that's the challenge for me every book, but I think I really did do something special this time.
Is it my mic or Brad's mic? And can we get a hand?
Is it mine?
All right. You want to trade mics? Because your stuff's more important than mine.
Well, let's see. Or I don't mind
Right.
going to a handheld. I don't mind going to a handheld mic if that's easier, because I'm very comfortable doing that.
Yeah, we'll get it done. Excellent.
Okay,
Looks
here
like
comes
we got a
one.
handheld mic.
Perfect.
I am blessed with a voice that doesn't even... My program director at my radio station here at KBC in Los Angeles says that I don't actually need a microphone. You can open up the window in Culver City and y'all can hear me on the 405. All right, so we're good. So 19 books in. I do want to talk specifically about Backlash, but before we do, just in terms of the whole story arc of, as John pointed out, you really have sort of honed in on this new post-Cold War era and the challenges that America has. And he's right. We're sitting in a cathedral here to not just President Reagan, but of course American exceptionalism. What president embodies American exceptionalism more in our lifetimes than Ronald Reagan? And Scott Harvath and his teams throughout all of the books, they're the defenders of American exceptionalism. They are willing to risk their lives for that. So I guess I want to start with how the challenges have evolved over the years. I mean, the first book was pre-9/11, right?
The first book actually came out within 2 months of 9/11. So, but it had already been at the printer, and the challenge I had gone through in The Lions of Lucerne, and I'd had a character talking about the threats from terrorism, and it laid out some of the biggest terrorists in the history, or in modern history, post-Cold War history, and bin Laden wasn't in there. And so you had 9/11 happen right as we were at press, and we literally had to stop the presses because you couldn't put up, our book was going to come out right after 9/11, and we couldn't have it not mentioned in this conversation, bin Laden. So I think I was probably one of the first thriller authors to put his name into a novel.
And now as you've evolved, I mean, in recent years, certainly there were a lot of books that focused on radical Islamic terrorism. Recent years, the focus has been our threats from China and now Russia, although they utilize Islamic terrorists as their puppets, sock puppets in
Proxies,
some cases.
yes.
Yeah. And so and now the Russian arc has been very strong recently. Is that because you, Brad Thor, believe that that's one of our biggest threats globally, or do you think it's just Russia's pretty compelling and pretty interesting and fascinating to write about?
So Politico named me to their 50 list last year, and they said I was on the list for taking the Cold War era thriller into a new generation of conflict. So I'm a voracious consumer of news, and I look at the news and I say, what if it happened this way? Or what if what's really going on is this? And Stephen King once said that a writer is someone who's trained their mind to misbehave. And that's definitely how I operate. So I was particularly interested last year when I did Spy Master. I had read everything in my books. I call what I do faction, where you don't know where the facts end and the fiction begins. And 2 years ago, I had read a study that the Pentagon was wargaming what would happen if Russia tried to take a smaller NATO member, if they tried to go in and take back Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Estonia, and they war-gamed it again and again and again. They switched the teams up, put the generals from the Russia side onto the NATO side, and the US and NATO lost every single time. There was no way to prevent the state from being taken. And I thought, this is fascinating stuff for a thriller. So I didn't want to get too much into current politics, but obviously NATO's been in the news a lot. Is NATO paying its 2%, are the NATO members paying their 2% of GDP towards their military and all this kind of stuff? And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you had a president that said, I don't want to have the U.S. drawn into a war for a country many Americans could not point to on the globe, especially we've been through Iraq and Afghanistan. And I said, okay, what might a president who doesn't want to go to war be willing to do to prevent it happening? Would you take a guy like Scott Harvath and take the chains off of him and let him go and stop something? And that's how I wrote Spy Master, last summer's book. And I thought, okay, Scott Harvath has been very, very successful thwarting the plans of the Russians in multiple books, going all the way back to my third book, State of the Union. I thought, now what might the Russians be willing to do to get Harvath off the chessboard? And that's where Backlash opens up.
By the way, many of the conversations I've had with Brad Thor over the years involve glasses with a very rich brown liquid boarding Kentucky in front of us, and I can attest to the fact that, yes, his mind does, in fact, misbehave quite a bit. It was one night in Chicago when...
Oh boy, here we go.
Well, we'll get to that another time. All right, so I get all of that. I do. Here's what's drawn to me about this book, though, is that that's not Russia.
No.
That's
not
That's
Russia.
a hammer and sickle. That's the Soviet Union. So, I mean, what's going on there in terms of your perception of who Russia is right now?
Right, so that's a great point. So it really is the Soviet Union just in better suits. All of these guys, the oligarchs, it really is a modern...
The hats aren't as good, though.
No, the hats...
Those Soviet
nice
hats rock,
fur
right?
hats.
I mean...
So with this book, what I wanted to do was delve into... I liked it, as I said, pick out facts that I put into my fiction to make that faction. And what I found fascinating about Russia is, so all of you in here, I assume, have heard of private military corporations like Blackwater and things like that. Those are illegal in Russia, yet one operates with impunity, and that one answers to Vladimir Putin. And it's called the Wagner Group, and it's named after one of Hitler's favorite composers, Wagner. And the Special Forces soldier who started the Wagner Group chose that as his own call sign. There is a fascinating and actually horrible and terrifying quasi-religion that took root in Russia as the Soviet Union was dissolving. And it is a hybrid pagan cult and a Nazi worship. You would think, okay, Thor, that's something you're making up for this new book. It sounds like the perfect villain. But this ideology exists, and it's rampant through this private military corporation called Wagner. And Wagner, if anybody in here has ever heard the term little green men, the people that went into Ukraine to foment revolution, when we heard about Russians going into Venezuela to back up Maduro's failing regime in case his military turned against him, and Russians in Syria. These are all from this organization because Putin can turn around and say, this isn't really the Russian military.
Right.
These are private actors, they're mercenaries, things like that. So I put them in this book because I am concerned about what Russia's desires are. And Putin has been very clear. He tried to take Georgia under George W. Bush. Putin successfully took the Crimean Peninsula. And what's fascinating about that is when the Soviet Union broke up, a third of their nuclear stockpile was in Ukraine. And we knew the Ukrainians would not be able to hold on to it, wouldn't be able to maintain their nukes. And so we asked them, we said, would you please agree to dismantle and get rid of all these nukes? We promise you will never be invaded, you will maintain your territorial integrity, and nothing bad's going to happen. And they said, okay, if you get the Russians to sign it too. Well, that was kind of worthless because years later, Putin went in and took part of Ukraine away in the form of the Crimean Peninsula. But he did it by putting the Wagner guys in early and stirring things up. And that's how they work.
Yeah, and see, now this is what I love. I'm sure, I'm trying to be a dispassionate interviewer here, but I'm a fan of these books. I'm a fan of this writer. And I don't know about you, but what I love is when I'm reading something in a Brad Thor book and it happens 6 months later. Or it references something that really happened maybe a year and a half ago. And of course, all of that happened with the, Ukraine giving up their weapons and the Crimean Peninsula invasion by Russia, all of that happened after President Obama promised that he'd have more flexibility after the 2012 election. And maybe, that was obviously part of the flexibility, or it certainly appears, because we didn't really have a robust response.
No, we didn't.
So are there, which brings us to the Carlton Group, which is this great private enterprise that the United States calls on once in a while, often, well, at least once a year,
Yes,
for the last
that's right.
19
every
years.
Summer, every summer the phone
Every
rings.
summer, last week of June. How real is that? I mean, does the President of the United States, whoever he or she happens to be, can they pick up the phone and call a Reed Carlton and say, yeah, I need Scott to do a job for me?
Well, with the rise of private military corporations like Blackwater, I saw the next thing being outsourcing intelligence gathering, intelligence analysis, perhaps even performing certain sensitive operations that could allow the president to maintain plausible deniability. Yeah, I didn't know that was happening, blah, 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 blah. And I'm a student of history, and I was fascinated when Porter Goss was the director of Central Intelligence and was sent in to clean out the deadwood at the CIA. The CIA is packed with incredible Americans, incredible patriots. There also is a certain degree of red tape at the CIA. It has become a big bureaucracy. We set up our stations in embassies around the world, and the station chief has to answer to the ambassador, and we're bringing CIA personnel through who bring their families to these countries and stay there for 2 years and all this kind of stuff.
Through the whole Brad Thor canon, there are various moments where it's just said the people at the CIA can't be trusted with this. It's not a disparaging remark to them.
No,
it's just,
and not
it's
that they
the
can't
operation.
be trusted. It's that there is a glut of middle management there that are risk adverse. And so I happen to be friendly with the gentleman who put together the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA, and he had been quite frustrated with it. Ran very well in the beginning, and then anything that's in government eventually gets consumed by government and gets slowed down. And he was upset as he saw. He was from the wild Bill Donovan kind of OSS days, the precursor to the CIA, where Bill Donovan said, if you fall forward in service of the mission so that you advance the cause of America. So when you've got these incredibly brave men and women who are willing to go out and do some of this nation's most dangerous business, and they're being told, well, you have to resubmit the request because commas are out of place because you've got somebody who doesn't want to sign off on the operation, that's problematic. So for me, in my fictional world, I saw this kind of group as the next thing, that they would be able to hire former spies and things like this and be able to go do jobs that needed to be done but could only be done if they weren't hampered by the red tape, the hamstringing that too often happens to great patriots throughout the intelligence community.
And they have access to really cool private jets and weapons. And I love the description of those things as well. So let's get into specifics about this book in particular, Backlash. It is different than your other books. I hate to say this because I think it's an amazing book and it's a thrill ride. So when I say it's different, I don't want you to think that the other ones weren't, but it is different in that instead of Scott Harvath, and I don't think I'm doing a spoiler here, instead of Scott Harvath being, leading a mission to stop a terrorist attack or some horrible thing to happen to us or to our allies, he is immediately transported into a life or death situation, and Scott Harvath is trying to basically survive an unsurvivable situation.
Right. So I wanted to learn more about what our men and women in the military go through, a particular school that takes place called SEER School. And SEER is an acronym for Survive, Evade, Resist, Escape. And one of the things, as I was talking to SEER instructors, that I learned is that they have to mentally be prepared. If you only get one chance, you have to be ready to take it. No, you got to do it. You got to try to get out and take that chance. And I thought, okay, this would be really interesting. What might Harvath do if he was in a situation where he had to draw on everything he had learned in every class as a SEAL and beyond that, and he'd be someplace bad, someplace far away from home? What would he do? And then back in the United States, what would we do if we lost a guy like Harvath? And I found out, this is very interesting, it comes back to my roots in Southern California of going to school at USC. I had a neighbor who is an attorney. He was a Navy JAG, and he's actually Hugh Hewitt's law partner, named Robert O'Brien, and we were neighbors when I was in college. And Robert got chosen by the Trump administration to fulfill a role called the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. This was a program that was set up by the Obama administration in the wake of the journalist James Foley being kidnapped and murdered by ISIS. There was a lot of angst and difficulty and stress. Who's in charge of trying to fix this? Is it the State Department? Is it the CIA? Is it the Department of Defense? And the Obama administration created something called the Hostage Fusion Recovery Cell at the FBI, at FBI headquarters. And it's a war room. You can imagine any Hollywood movie with the clocks of different time zones and television screens. But it seats people at desks from every important agency, the Treasury Agency, the NSA, the FBI, the CIA. One water cooler, they all go to that water cooler. One coffee pot, they all use that coffee pot. And they all talk to each other and share information. So if an American gets grabbed overseas, they all start to get together and say, can we get this person back via something in the Treasury Department? Can they apply sanctions or freeze assets? Or do we need to talk to the Pentagon about getting a SEAL team in there to get this person out? So the idea was to put the needs of the families and the hostage above all else, and to move heaven and earth to get them out. So when I learned about what would happen, particularly not just an American, but an American like Scott Harvath, what would happen, it was fascinating, and I ended up dedicating the book to Robert O'Brien, who's been working tirelessly, nonstop. He's always on the road, traveling to some of the absolute worst places on the planet, trying to get Americans back. Fascinating job he has.
Yeah, in fact, when you revealed this to me, that Robert was sort of the inspiration for Rogers, I think is the name of the character.
Yes.
In the book, Meredith and I had dinner over at Hugh Hewitt's house in Alexandria, and Robert was with us. In fact, he was still staying at the Courtyard in Foggy Bottom. He hadn't gotten an apartment yet. He'd only been on the job for a few weeks, and we did not want to. I drove him back to the Courtyard. We didn't want to let him out of the car. I mean, because he was describing what he's in the middle of doing, and that is remarkable. Although you made him way cooler in the book than in real life. By the way, now's a good time to let you know that I heard some murmuring when Brad mentioned that he is a graduate of USC. You're a Trojan.
I am, yep.
AM 790 KBC, now the home of Trojan football.
Good plug.
And my daughter is going to UCLA.
There you go. Fantastic. That's great.
My oldest daughter. My second daughter just got inducted to the Naval Academy, so that's... All right, enough about my kids. I just like cheap applause, and it's this time in the program where we get the cheap applause to keep everybody going. But basically what you just described, that's what the book takes you on. This is the roller coaster where you switch from scene to scene to scene, as you do so well in your books.
And if I may, I've always loved The Odyssey by Homer, and this idea of someone returning from war and constantly being knocked off course. And I decided I would reread The Odyssey, but I wanted the most recent English translation. And there's a great translation, and I'm blowing a great plug for the gentleman who did it, because he took out all the repetitions, he used regular everyday language, made it very relatable. And I found him through a review in the New York Times, and it was a fascinating review that said, people going to battle should read the Iliad by Homer, because it teaches them what parts of their civilized selves to leave at home to be successful on the battlefield. Warriors returning from battle should read the Odyssey, because it teaches them what parts of themselves they picked up on the battlefield or tapped into on the battlefield that need to be left there so that they can reintegrate into society. So much of Odysseus's Odyssey that he went through, Harvath is experiencing in this book. It is a physical attempt to get home. It's a psychological and emotional attempt to get home. And I've always been fascinated. My dad had been at Camp Pendleton as a Marine. My dad and I used to watch Westerns all the time. He loved Westerns, Magnificent Seven being one of his favorite. And I love the idea of a man with a code, which is absolutely my dad, struggling to protect those who can't protect themselves, even to that person, even to your own detriment, that you would do everything to honor your code. And that's some of the stuff that I wove into Backlash as well.
And so that's something that I've been wanting to ask you about this book and about Scott Harvath as a character in particular, because, listen, one of the most vivid things about Brad's books, I think, and about Scott Harvath and the way he goes about doing what he does, especially the way he interrogates people when he needs answers. And he is brutal in getting those answers. And what Scott goes through physically, emotionally, psychologically in this book, I mean, is he going to be okay? I mean, he goes through a lot in this book, and there is some discussion in the book about if Scott is still Scott.
I had a lovely interview with a woman in San Francisco for the International Thriller Writers Association, and she talked about the lyricism in the book. And I said, lyricism? What lyricism? And she had all these portions of the book that she had dog-eared, and she would read to me my own writing, and I couldn't believe I wrote it. This book was, the tough thing for me writing this book was that there were so many things Harvath was going through that I've never been through. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, a tough guy like Harvath, and he's in this battle for his life, his own life, in his down moments, what does he do? What does he reflect on? And how much do we see into his soul? But there's this constant battle that Harvath's going through where he knows if he allows that small flickering flame that's left in him of humanity to be snuffed out, it's never coming back.
Yeah.
He's going to be completely cold, completely dark, and that he has to figure out, is it worth it to survive? Am I going to have to survive? Am I going to have to become absolutely inhuman to do so?
Well, as one of your characters in the team, Scott's team says in the book, Scott Harvath has killed more people than cancer, I think is how you put it.
The expression.
But what he does in this book, there's some brutality that he exercises, but what I found interesting, and I'd love for you to expand on this, is every time he does something relatively brutal, Scott's voice tells us that he's doing it for a very specific reason and purpose. That's important, isn't it, to sort of explain his brutality? Because it's part of his strategy.
So I have one particular scene that my daughter suggested. And my 16-year-old daughter, which was really funny, my agent didn't like it, my editor loved it, thought it was just so pitch perfect. And my daughter's very astute, and she said, you can't have this scene without passion, because this is him unleashing everything on the first person to get in his way. So I think it's important to, the challenge for me was how much is enough. It was Goldilocks, right? It's either too warm or too cold. This one's just right. And so that for me was where I was just angst-ridden as I wrote it, trying to make sure that I gave you enough, that people wouldn't say, oh, there's no way this big tough guy would be feeling those things. I've had men come up to me, veterans come up to me and say that they were overcome with emotion in certain parts of the book. And so I must have done it right. And I think it just takes kind of trusting that process. And it's very easy for a writer to constantly critique and go back and rewrite. That's the writer's worst inclination, is to say, well, I'm not going to write anything new today. Let me go back and rewrite what I did yesterday. And you can stay on chapter 1 for weeks or months if you're not careful.
A couple of quick house cleaning here. We are going to have a chance for Q&A. I'm totally cognizant of the fact that I'm not asking all the questions you want asked. So you get to ask your questions too. I would ask, though, that those who have read the book, you can tell that we're treading really carefully here. Don't spoil anything, because there are some really major things that happen in this book.
And I'm hearing from people that this is their favorite book. People who loved my first book, this is their favorite. And by the way, Larry and I had talked about this, that without drawing a parallel as to the Bond movies I use as an example. You don't need to have ever seen a James Bond movie before to go to the new one and enjoy it. So I tell people with my book, you can start with Backlash. You don't have to have ever read a Brad Thor book before.
This one, by the way, I wanted to, when you mentioned that last time we spoke, this one reminds me a little bit of Skyfall, actually, in that it's so very personal. And it involves the whole sort of structure around Scott's life. You know?
I own that movie and I like that movie. I have not heard that one before, and I agree. There is a certain, it is very personal, and I wanted to shake things up, turn it upside down, throw all the pieces on the floor, step on them, blowtorch them, put them back in the box, because I think that's fun. And I read all the time. I love books. I'm a huge reader.
Yeah.
And I also like things on TV, and Ray Donovan is one of my favorite shows on Showtime, and I love the fact
Who
that...
here watches Ray Donovan?
Okay, so there's a couple people.
It's naughty. This is a very, you know...
I like the fact
It's a little edgy.
That things don't always go his way. And I think that makes for an interesting book if you turn the pages and say, oh, there's no way he's going to get out of this. How does he get...
You know, it's funny you should say that, because, see, I'm looking at Skymaster and Backlash as a two-book package to me. Because, now, I'm sorry for saying that, to me in Spymaster, things did not go as wrong as they should have for Scott Harvath. He had a couple of hiccups along the way there, but they resolved pretty quickly. You know, usually things go really upside down for him. In this book, everything goes upside down. So I really appreciated that.
Making up for the last book.
And, well, you know, and again, not taking away the enjoyment of it at all. I loved Spymaster. Again, couldn't get through it. I want to ask you a couple of things about the characters that you develop here outside of Scott Harvath. The team that we've now grown accustomed to over the last, I guess, 6 or 7 books, the regular characters that come in and sort of work with him. I was struck by this. I've gotten, through my career now, been able to meet people who are Delta or CAG or what they're calling themselves these days.
Yeah, the unit, whatever it is today.
MARSOC guys, Marines, recon guys, SEAL guys. They all have their own distinct vernacular. They have their own very distinct personalities, and you get that in your characters because the team is a few from these special ops guys, those special ops guys. That's a minor detail, but how important is it when you do things like that? You've got to be a little self-satisfied when you create dialogue that is so specific to those special ops guys.
That's because I buy a lot of beers and a lot of steak dinners, and I sit there and I close my mouth and I listen to how they talk to each other and what they say. It's fun because there are several categories that I put nice comments on Goodreads or fan letters in, and one of them is when I hear from our men and women in the military, law enforcement, or the intelligence community, you nailed it. That's how we talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's the gear we carry. Those are the situations we're all facing at work.
These are the stupid jokes. This is the sarcasm.
Exactly.
This is the dark humor.
The graveyard, and particularly that graveyard humor, because that's what gets them through those really tough times. And if you're gonna be ground down, it is not the job for you. And it's self-defense, sense of humor, and making fun of each other, making fun of the situation. That's what that is self-defense.
Scott Harvath began as SEAL Team 3, or I believe, or the
SEAL Team 2.
SEAL Team 2. Sorry, that's why I asked. And they, of course, specialize in winter situations. He was a skier. He was a skier in his or professional skier, right? Is this, other than the first book, Lions of Lucerne, as a Secret Service agent, he's dealing with a winter condition? I can't remember. Is this the next book where he actually deals with this kind of very vivid winter, drawing on those skills and that training?
I mean, he did in Blowback. There was a big when he was going after the bioweapon that Hannibal had lost crossing the Alps. There was a big hunt on for that.
Yeah.
There was an ice cavern. That's one of the things that pops back up into mind. I'd have to go through,
But this is about 75% winter.
Right. It's normally it's hot and dusty and stuff like that. So, but yeah, this is winter from front to back.
Yeah, and how much real detailed research did you have to go into with that? And did they ever tell you, yeah, you can say this, but you can't say that because that's way too, sources and methods kind of thing?
In this book, no. I've had that happen in other books where I've worked and spent time with guys, and they've said, well, Thor, we told you point A, we told you point C, and you figured out B all by yourself, and B's got to come out of the book. So I've had that happen, and I've gone and changed it. In this book, I had a friend at Coronado, and I was saying, hey, I want to tap into the winter warfare training that the SEALs do, particularly the stuff up in Alaska. And I got to talk with one of the SEALs' biggest instructors up there in Alaska, and to find out, what would you do in this situation? And they said, okay, Thor, well, what would you do? There's a plane crash in the beginning of the book. And they said, okay, put yourself in that situation. What would you do? And I'm like, I'd be looking for a hat and gloves. It's cold out. He goes, not me. He goes, I'm looking around to see if anybody who is on that plane who's a potential threat is taken care of or not. He said, that's number one. Number two, yeah, the temperature's going to drop. And he said, what would you do if you couldn't find a hat, gloves, or a coat? What would you do? And I'm like, I'll look for blankets. He said, yeah, if you don't find those. And he told me he'd be ripping insulation out of the walls of the aircraft and stuffing that in his coat if he had to. He'd be looking for anything salvageable that could help him as he made his way away from the plane. He'd be looking for anything he could turn into a backpack. I mean, it was really interesting to see the process. And I'm like, well, how far would you try to get away? And he said, I actually might not try to get away. He said, I might dig a trench right there and cover myself up, depending on what the situation was, and I might lay in that for 3 days, hoping that they, if they don't bring dogs in and stuff like this. So it was fascinating to war game with somebody who would know what Harvath knows, and that was a neat thing to do.
I got to ask you this. There's one scene. There's a firefight, and I'm not giving away any real major detail here. Spoiler alert: there's a firefight in a Brad Thor book. And they take cover behind I believe you described it as an oblong slab of moose. Which is a great, by the way, use of the language. Is that something you invented, or did somebody tell you a story about how they were hiding behind a slab of beef or a slab of meat?
They actually were using the slab of moose because it can help throw off drones that are using looking for heat signatures. So you can actually hide somebody if it's a frozen carcass. The guy I was talking to said, envision Luke Skywalker when Han Solo cut that thing open and
Right.
put him inside.
That's
it to
exactly
keep him
what I
warm.
pictured.
They said, think of something like that, and that'd be a good way, particularly if this was an area where hunting was done and there were carcasses around and stuff like that, and it was frozen. You could potentially do that.
An oblong slab of moose, I believe, is those. That's
Moose or reindeer?
Those are
One
more
or
of
the
the
other.
lyric,
More the lyrical
lyric
writing,
words, yeah,
yes, yes.
that I
Funny
wanted
she
to
didn't
quote
mention
back
that
to
in that
you.
interview,
See, I didn't
but,
even have to read it. I remembered that one. By the way, just so we can be prepared for, are we ready already?
The microphones are out.
Great. We do have microphones up if you want to ask your own questions. I do ask that you only do it on microphone since we are streaming this, so they won't hear you. And you want to
Unless you
make
use the
sure that
mic.
you're heard. Here we go, sir.
Hi, when might we expect one of your books to be made into a movie?
This is a great question. So when might we expect?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Long overdue.
So my next book is going to be all about the twists and turns in Hollywood.
Oh my God, a horror story.
Yeah, for a town like Los Angeles that's filled with so many beautiful people, I have kissed every single frog in the entire county of LA, I'm convinced. We were at one particular studio, and new executives came in, and that's very common in the film industry, that when a new exec comes in at the top, that a lot of the projects underneath come up for review and don't make it into the new executive's portfolio. So we are at a different studio right now, and the producers just got back from Cannes, where they set up a relationship with a foreign co-producing partner and international distributors. So we're actually in a deal right now where we're talking about a film and television package. It's the golden age of TV now with Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime.
Yeah.
So we're very excited, but as I've said to you before, I will believe it when you and I are sitting in the movie theater for the premiere and we've got our popcorn and our Coke and we're ready, the curtains go back and the movie starts. Then I'll believe it.
Fake news, it will be a bourbon, not a Coke. But it will be in one of those big old cups that you get. But yeah, I can't wait for that day. Well, his books are so cinematic, right? You see it as you're reading it, and that is such a gift. How do you hand over something like that to a screenwriter, and how does the writer maintain their vision?
Well, it's part of the way we structure the deal that I can stay involved. I'm not going to tell anybody how to make a movie. My job is to be there and to give them any assistance they need about the world of Scott Harvath, but also
Right,
to
but
point out-
famously, like Some of All Fears, where suddenly, I mean, that book was just turned upside down with a completely different villain, and Hollywood sort of, I think, ruined that book, in my opinion.
Yeah, they can change, but the thing that I'm looking forward to is particularly the television part. Did anybody in here see John le Carré's The Night Manager with Tom Hiddleston? So they did it over like 6 or 7 episodes. It was fantastic. So for me, that's a big appeal because
Yeah.
I'd rather see one of my books turned into a television season of 6 or 7 episodes, because then you don't have to cut as much out as you would
Me too.
for a film. So
Well, and how much did the success of Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime help your cause here? I mean, as I was watching that series on Amazon Prime, I was thinking, okay, this is the venue. This is how you do it.
I agree, and Game of Thrones did very well for George R.R. Martin, so the TV stuff is really, really cool. And as one producer buddy of mine said, the billboard stays up on Sunset Boulevard a lot longer if you have a season of shows than just your
brilliant.
opening couple of weeks for a film.
That's brilliant. Just by a show of hands, would you want the Brad Thor cinematic or television version? You do want that, yes. All right.
It's fantastic.
Follow-up question, do you want it to begin at the beginning of the books? Do you want it to start with Lions of Lucerne? Do you think that's the right way to go?
Okay, that's very interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
And by the way, going back and reading that one, I think I read it the second time, I think 2 years ago. It's really involved. I mean, that is one of those ones where you would, I think, need to do a series.
And so this is interesting. My writing has changed over the years as our consumption of entertainment has changed. I mean, Patterson really was the king of those short, crisp, cinematic chapters, and that's how I'm writing right now, because I think it was Mickey Spillane that said the first chapter sells the book, the last chapter sells the next book, but it's what comes in between the first and last chapter I think that's really important. So I love when I do an interview and the host says, the reason I didn't get any sleep last night is because of our next guest, Brad Thor. So Lions was very rich with 4 or 5, maybe even 6 different plot lines woven all together, and now I do a max of 3. So it's changed, but that's because I'm competing against other things. it takes a lot of discipline to read a book. It's easy to watch TV or watch a movie, but the books take discipline to read. So what I wanted to do was make it so that you didn't have to worry about your self-discipline. You couldn't help it but be drawn in, and it gets a hold of you right on page one.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of, again, back to my Midwestern values and my parents saying, treat every day on the job as if it's your first job. My primary goal is to entertain you. So if you're entertained by the books, bam, I've done it. If you close them, knowing a little bit more about special operations, the SEALs, spies, the intersection of politics and warfare, any of that neat stuff that I kind of flavor the stories with, then that's the icing on the cake.
We do have mics on both sides, by the way. If you have questions, just raise your hand so we can get right to them. Oh, here we go.
Perfect.
We are going to stage left, house right here.
First,
Yep.
okay. The first chapter in Lions and Lucerne is one of the greatest things I've ever read before.
Thank you.
Just blew me away. But I have a question for you. And I can't remember the character's name, but the dwarf with the dog.
The troll.
Nicholas.
Nicholas the
Nicholas.
troll.
I was gonna say
Who
Mark.
loves Nicholas the troll?
Yeah.
He's gone through quite a bit, hasn't he?
That character is unbelievable. How did you?
This is one of my favorite questions. So thank you for asking about Nicholas. I was in a very dark place because with my children, they kept playing Dora the Explorer over and over and over and over and over. And I decided, well, if you can't beat them, you got to join them because I couldn't get my kids to pick up any other show. And I said, okay, I'm going to pick one character that I like because I was ready to put a bullet in that monkey, Boots the monkey. I couldn't stand that. But there was one character, the troll, and I really liked the troll. He was a grumpy old troll who lived under a bridge.
Yes.
in
He has
Dora
a
the
song.
Explorer.
Who wants to sing the song with me?
Singing
No,
that
sorry.
song. I'll probably I'll snap if I hear the song. But I was fascinated. Here's this little troll, and he was demanding that if anybody wanted to cross his bridge, they had to solve a riddle. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. You know, he's not that big, he's not that tough, but he's demanding that you need to do this for me. And in our old neighborhood in Chicago, there was a little person who was always impeccably dressed, like maybe an executive at some company downtown. And I'd see this little person getting on public transportation on some days. And my children would ask me as I took them to school, you know, Daddy, why is that person small? And I would talk to them about that. And what do you think that person does for a living? And I would say, well, what do you think that person does for a living? And they would try to equate, well, what would a small person, and I would say, is there any reason that this person couldn't do any job that a big person couldn't? And so we had this nice talk about how people are different and all this kind of stuff. But it got me thinking, what the heck does this person do for a living? What? And
Now that you mention it.
And so as a writer, and back to that Stephen King thing, right? A writer is someone who's trained their mind to misbehave. So I thought, all right, what's the worst thing this person could be doing? Let's pretend they're dressed really nice, but it's really dark what they're going to do. They're getting on the Chicago Transit Authority bus, and it's the worst possible thing you could imagine. And Loving Spies and John le Carré and stuff like that, and Clancy, I thought, all right, what if this person's involved as a spy? What if this person's involved in blackmailing people and intelligence? And that's how that was born. That's where I got the idea is, wouldn't it be cool if this person blackmailed people for a living? And then I said, okay, well, that's fine, but how does that person protect themselves? And that's where I got the idea for the two huge dogs that the troll has. So again, thank you. It's one of my favorite questions.
Yeah,
so I love that
and
one.
by the way, Meredith now wants one of those dogs, so thanks for that.
You're going to need a third job for the dog food.
Did you ever tell the guy in your neighborhood that you based a character on
No,
that
I don't know that
observation?
person, and I no.
Yeah.
I never did.
If you like Nicholas, if you like the troll, you are gonna, and you have appreciated his evolution over the last 10 books, you're really gonna love his appearances here in Backlash. It's really something. And when I started reading about Nicholas in this book, I got emotional about it. What a story arc for him and what he's been through. Is it me, or is he taking on some of the vernacular of his friends at the Carlton Group? I mean, some of his phrases now, and so he's actually taking on sort of the sarcastic wit that he didn't have when he was a loner.
And that's also part of his development as a character. I think we all want to fit in, particularly at work, right? So I think that's, and I appreciate
very
that you've
sweet.
noticed that.
It's very
and
sweet.
So that's him trying to get along with the people he works with, trying to identify with them, and the position he gets put in this book, there's a certain amount of things that fall into his lap. So it is his way of showing that he respects and cares for those people he works with.
Yeah, that's great. Again, any question? I'll fill in, trust me, if you don't have one. Okay, we have one here. We'll pass the microphone over. Oh, we've got plenty more. Okay, excellent, because I got plenty more too.
Okay, so 19 books. Scott's been changing. How do you keep track of what he's done, who he's worked with, who's gone, who's come in? I mean, there's so many changes over the 19 books. How do you do it?
Yeah, that could be a real danger.
It's very low tech. It's very low tech. God bless my wife. She, a while ago, realized that if I kept writing Scott Harvath, I would lose threads if we didn't keep them going. So my wife is my first reader. She sees a manuscript before my editor even does, and I call my wife Zorro because she's got a red pen and she scratches stuff out and takes, get rid of this, get rid of that. But as she reads the manuscript, she reads through the first time for story and to make sure that there are no continuity issues and so on and so forth. She goes through a second time with 3x5 cards. And we have recipe boxes, those little recipe boxes, and she will write, whether it's a new character or a recurring character, she'll add to them in the recipe box what page they come up on, what they're doing in the book and everything. So I have this very low-tech database. If the house ever burns, I'm not going for the wedding photos, I'm going for the recipe boxes in the office.
You might want to think about a spreadsheet or something on this.
And you know what, I actually do a spreadsheet when I'm writing the books, so I don't have a formula. Every book is different. It is completely organic. I do not outline. My agent one time thought it'd be neat if I outlined a book, and so Dan Brown is a friend of mine who wrote Da Vinci Code, and we share the same agent, and I got to see his outline for Da Vinci, and it was fascinating to see what didn't make it into the book. But when I tried to outline a thriller, I lost all the passion for it. I want to have the experience when I'm writing it that you have reading it. I go home some nights and my wife says, "Oh, I can tell it's a rough day. It's a bourbon night," because of the expression on my face. And she says, "Don't worry. I know you've painted Harvath into a corner. You'll figure it out tomorrow." But the spreadsheet part that I do is that every time I write a chapter, I've got a spreadsheet and I enter in who it is in the chapter, what's happening, what day it is, what part of the world, and in particular, what time zone it is, because I bounce back and forth all the time. And so I can see Harvath, I always color code that cell that he's in green, so I can tell, okay, it's been now, I've got 2 yellows and a blue, it's been 3 chapters since we've seen Harvath, this next one should be a Harvath chapter. And that's kind of the guardrails that I have writing.
We had a couple of questions over here as well, and there, and there, and there. We'll go here.
Hi, I'm curious, do you see yourself continuing Scott Harvath as your kind of life mission, or do you have other characters or subjects you want to write out about someday?
Perhaps a second Athena project.
Right, perhaps. Thank you, it's a great question. Yes, I intend to keep, so it's yes to both. I believe that James Bond was Ian Fleming's alter ego, and that Jack Ryan was Clancy's, and Harvath is definitely mine. So I'm going to keep going with him, but I also want to do some other things, some other projects that are not even related to Harvath, but are still in the genre. And I think Backlash was me going to a new level in my writing where I trusted my gut a lot more than I ever have before. And the response I've gotten from Backlash, with people saying, "It's your best book ever. I read it in one sitting." I mean, every city we've traveled to, every day when I open up Facebook or Twitter, there's all of these lovely, lovely responses from my bosses. I'm getting good performance reviews coast to coast, which is what I aim for. So yeah, Harvath will keep going, but now these things that I've kind of had on the shelf that I've always wanted to do, I'm thinking to myself, now's the time. You've got this passion, do them alongside with Harvath. So the key for me is making sure that I protect as much time for myself as possible. So I think I'm going to step back a little bit from the day-to-day operations of the business where I'm constantly focused on, all right, let's tweak this ad in this newspaper. How many people have signed up for the newsletter this week? All of these things, that's part of me being a Midwesterner and the son of a Marine, because my parents taught me, pay attention to the details. The people who pay attention to the details of their business are the people who will be successful. So I happen to have a wonderful person here who works with me, who is my detail person and has an eye for everything. And so I'm blessed that I have some wonderful colleagues who I work with, who I trust to take that over to free up more of my time. And then I just have to stay off Twitter and Facebook and social media, Instagram. I think the TV's coming out of the office.
So you're
the
not
Wi-Fi.
running for president
No,
anymore.
I am not. That's been off the table for well over a year. Actually, from the next morning.
The
when
next
my wife saw
morning,
that
I
tweet.
know.
Yeah, that was done.
That was fun.
Yeah.
Brad sends me a text with a link to the tweet where he says if no one else steps up, he's going to run in the Republican primary. And so, of course, I write it up at the Washington Times as a post, and I print it. And the next day, he's like, "Oh, dude, I don't know what I was thinking, man. I just printed it."
If you decide to run for office, ask your spouse first. That's the only piece of political advice I'm going to give tonight.
So what you're saying is you are going to get to that children's series about Dora's evil twin.
Right. She comes and kills
you've been-
Dora and the monkey.
Yes!
That's
With extreme prejudice.
with the troll. The grumpy old troll under the bridge is going to be the hitman.
And Swiper finally wins. Any other, here we go, we got a few back there.
How did you get started in writing?
How did I get started in writing?
There you go.
I had wanted to be a writer ever since I was a little boy. You ask any writer, and they will tell you it's. I used to make a Davy Berkowitz joke, and I would say it's because the dog told me to. You know, the voices in my head told me I had to do it. But it is true. There is a gentle madness to writers in wanting to write. And I went to USC and went in to be a business administration major because that's what my dad wanted. My dad, the Marine, said, boom, you go to school, you come out, and you'll take over the family business. And I switched my major halfway through at USC to creative writing and film and television production.
God, how'd that conversation go?
Well,
Dad?
I was able to hide it because the registrar said, you better make sure you're getting all the credits you need for that major. We can leave it business administration on the report card that goes home, but the classes underneath will be the legit classes. And so my dad's not dumb. The great Santini figured it out eventually that I went from microeconomics to introduction to poetry writing. And I never went back for any more business classes. So we chatted and everything, and it was lucky for me, it was the late 80s when a lot of bond traders were leaving New York to move to LA to get into film finance. And so my dad thought I was learning the film business, and he said, well, this is great. You just get a master's in business after you get your undergrad. I was making it worse for myself, and I thought, okay, I'll shine him on about the master's in business, and that's fine. And I got out from my undergrad stuff, and listen, my dad and my mom, the Marine and the flight attendant for TWA, that's the American dream, is to help your children get further ahead in life than you did. This is what's always made America great. In fact, President Reagan's first inaugural address is one of my favorite pieces. Whether you read it, whether you watch him on YouTube speaking, this idea that what's made America successful is that we unleash the individual genius of mankind like no nation ever before in history. And so the fact that we can subscribe to a set of ideals and values, by the way, you go to France and you want to be a Frenchman or a Frenchwoman, you can't. You weren't born there. There are people that don't look like the French that are born there, and they still can't be French people. But in America, if you subscribe to our set of ideas, you can be an American. And opportunity is afforded to people in amounts here in this country that have never been seen anywhere else. And it's one of the things that makes me proudest of being an American.
Amen. Oh, we've got one more. We've got room for one more. Oh, how do I choose? If you're a veteran. Oh, that didn't help either. All right, well, you've actually had your hand up for quite some time, sir.
Okay.
I'm sorry, sir, but he has the last few times.
I'll still take questions at the signing afterwards.
That's
so
true.
Feel free, we can
That's
save
true.
them.
First of all, I want to thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for being
It's
here.
a privilege. I wonder if you've ever used other veterans from other eras as inspiration to characters. I know from, I got to meet a man by the name of Lou Conter last year. He was one of the 4 surviving members of the USS Arizona. He lives in Grass Valley, where I live. And what's interesting is talking to the man and how humble they are, but also you can see where they came from. And I just wonder if we ever use that type of background from men from that type of era, or Korea, or Vietnam as inspiration.
I have, because their stories are so powerful. And, you know, as you know, the hardest thing is just getting them to talk. Because most of them that have been there and done that don't talk about it. So it is tough to find people who are willing to talk, but they are out there. So I've done, even Harvest boss, Reed Carlton, with everything he's seen, I had Reed Carlton's inspiration, this gentleman named Tommy Carver Banks, in one of the books. And so yeah, I do try to draw from those people and those experiences because unfortunately, not everybody has a long memory in this country. And the sacrifice and service of people going back beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, back to Korea and Vietnam, these are important people because every single man and woman who sign up for our military write a blank check that says up to and including my life. And every one of them is important and deserve the same amount of respect and honor. So, yes.
Amen. Well, that brings to a close this portion of the evening and our live stream, and I appreciate everyone watching out there on the miraculous, as my colleague Chris Plant says, Al Gore's amazing internet. Thank you for watching our stream. And then what Brad is going to do is he's going to move up to the gift shop, the museum store, where he will be signing your books and chatting with you, and you can ask your questions. If you don't have a book yet, you can get one here as well. And really fast, we have a handful of people who won a ticket tonight through AM 790 KABC in their book. Can I just see you real fast to say hi and thank you for, excellent, thank you for being here. And I'm glad you were here, and thanks for listening to KBC. And thank you, Brad Thor.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you to the Reagan Foundation for having me in the library. And thank you to all of you who came tonight. And also, yeah, thank you. Thank you. And there are signed books for anyone who can't stay. The library has books that have already been signed, too. If you want one, but you don't want to stand in line, they're up there in the museum store. So thank you again for coming.
Thanks a bunch. We'll see you up at the store.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. That went